Death at Blackwood Manor, a Hercule Poirot mystery. I'll write this complete mystery for you right here, all 14 chapters in full. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Last Supper at Blackwood. The rain had begun at 4:30, which Constance Blackwood later said she took as an omen. At the time, however, she had said nothing of the sort. She had merely stood at the tall drawing-room window of Blackwood Manor, watching the gravel drive turn dark with water, and remarked that Cook would be in a terrible temper if the game birds arrived late from the village. That was Constance's way, practical, contained, and almost aggressively composed. At 53, she was still handsome in the manner of old portraits. Strong jaw, grey-streaked hair swept back from a high forehead, and eyes the colour of winter slate. She had been mistress of Blackwood Manor for 26 years, first as the young wife of Sir Edmund Blackwood and, for the past 11 years, as his widow. In that role she had proved herself considerably more capable than Sir Edmund had ever been. Blackwood Manor stood in the North Yorkshire moors, some 4 miles from the market town of Harcastle. It was an Elizabethan house, not the grandest of its kind, but genuinely old, with low ceilings, panelled walls black with age, and a persistent smell of wood smoke that never quite left the stone corridors. The grounds ran to 40 acres, including a walled kitchen garden, a derelict gamekeeper's cottage, and a small ornamental lake that flooded every December without fail. The occasion for this particular gathering was the reading of the late Sir Edmund's revised will, or rather, the occasion that had been given to the assembled guests. Constance had invited them under the pretence of a family reunion, not wishing anyone to arrive with their expectations already arranged. She had learned from her solicitor, Mr. Gerald Fitch, that the contents would surprise several people. She thought it wisest to have them all together when the surprise arrived. The guests had come in through the afternoon. First to arrive had been Reginald Blackwood, Sir Edmund's elder son by his first wife. Reginald was 41, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the particular confidence of a man who has always believed money would come to him eventually. He worked, nominally, in London, managing what remained of the Blackwood family's investments, a task he performed with mediocre results and great self-satisfaction. He had brought no wife. The third Mrs. Reginald Blackwood was, by all accounts, currently in Biarritz, with someone more interesting. His younger half-sister, Philippa Norwood, arrived an hour later with her husband, Dr. James Norwood. Philippa was 34, fine-boned, and possessed of a nervous energy that expressed itself in constant small movements, adjusting a bracelet, smoothing her skirt, glancing at doorways. She was Sir Edmund's daughter by Constance, which made her relationship with Reginald somewhat more complicated than either of them acknowledged. Dr. Norwood was a quiet man, with clever, watchful eyes, and the deliberate calm of someone trained to observe before speaking. He practiced as a physician in Harrogate, and had the manner of a man who knew rather more about the people around him than he chose to let on. The fourth guest was Miss Arabella Fenchurch, who had served as Sir Edmund's personal secretary for 14 years before his death, and had remained at the manor in a vague advisory capacity ever since. She was 60, angular, and dressed with the austere precision of a woman who had spent a lifetime being practical. She had never married. It was widely assumed, by those who assumed such things, that she had been rather devoted to Sir Edmund, in ways that exceeded professional loyalty. Arabella herself neither confirmed nor denied this, and looked upon those who speculated with withering neutrality. The solicitor, Mr. Gerald Fitch, arrived at 6. He was a small, tidy man from York, with a brown leather case that he never allowed out of his sight, and the perpetually apologetic air of a man who regularly delivers unwelcome news. He greeted everyone with careful equality, accepted a sherry, and sat near the fire saying as little as possible. Dinner that evening was served at 8. The dining room was long and candle-lit, with ancestral portraits watching from the walls and silver that had been polished to an anxious gleam. Cook had, in the end, received her game birds in time, and the meal was excellent. Roast partridge, a rich gravy, potatoes from the kitchen garden, a lemon syllabub that nobody touched much, because by the time it arrived, the conversation had grown too uncomfortable for appetite. It had begun with Reginald, as such things often did. He had drunk rather too much of the good Burgundy and made a remark about the Manor's uncertain future that was clearly directed at Constance. She had replied with glacial composure that the Manor's future was entirely certain, which caused Reginald to set down his glass with a small, deliberate click. Philippa had looked at her husband. Dr. Norwood had studied his partridge. Miss Fenchurch had said, in a very clear voice, that the gravy was exceptional. Mr. Fitch had looked at the tablecloth. After dinner, the group had retired to the library, where the will was to be read the following morning. Constance had proposed an early night, citing the rain and the long journeys everyone had endured. The suggestion was accepted, with the particular relief of people grateful for an excuse to stop pretending to enjoy one another's company. At 11 o'clock, the house was quiet. The rain continued without apology. The portraits in the dining room stared at the empty table and the unfinished syllabub and the single wineglass that Reginald had left, uncharacteristically, half full. At 7:15 the following morning, Mrs. Hopwood, the housekeeper, went to call Mr. Reginald Blackwood for breakfast. She found him in the library, seated in the high-backed chair behind the writing desk, with Sir Edmund's silver letter-opener buried to the hilt between his third and fourth ribs. He had been dead for several hours. On the desk before him lay a single sheet of paper, blank except for 3 words written in a hand that was not his own. He knew everything. Mrs. Hopwood did not scream. She was a Yorkshire woman of 62 who had worked in service for 40 years and considered hysteria a form of self-indulgence. She walked directly to the telephone in the hallway, called the Harcastle police, and then put the kettle on. Chapter 2. The Shape of a Locked House. Inspector Colin Marsh of the Harcastle Constabulary was a competent man. Sergeant Fellows, his subordinate, frequently said so, generally in the apologetic tone of someone acknowledging that competence has its limits. Marsh arrived at Blackwood Manor at 8:30 with Fellows, a police surgeon named Dr. Eustace Peel, and a young constable whose primary function appeared to be standing in doorways looking solemn. The library was examined with professional thoroughness. Dr. Peel confirmed what was already apparent. Reginald Blackwood had been killed by a single penetrating wound to the chest, delivered from the front at close range. The weapon, the silver letter opener, a heavy, ornate piece engraved with the Blackwood crest, had been driven with considerable force between the ribs, puncturing the heart. Death would have been rapid, within minutes, and not entirely silent, though the storm had been loud enough to account for sounds that might otherwise have carried through the house. The time of death, Dr. Peel estimated, was somewhere between midnight and 2 in the morning. Rigour had set in fully, and the body's temperature had dropped to a degree consistent with several hours' exposure to the library's relatively cool air. The fireplace grate held ash from a fire that had burned down completely. It had been lit, then allowed to die. This was the first observation that Marsh found curious. The evening had been cold and wet, the kind of Yorkshire October night that drove people toward fires, yet the library fire, by all accounts, had not been lit when the household retired. Someone had entered that room after 11 o'clock, made a fire, and stayed long enough for it to burn entirely to ash. Either Reginald himself had done this before his death, which implied he had remained or returned to the library of his own accord, or his killer had. The library door had been found unlocked. There were 2 keys to it. One hung on a hook in the butler's pantry, and one was kept in Constance Blackwood's desk in the morning room. Both keys were accounted for, which suggested the door had never been locked at all, or had been relocked after the discovery. but Mrs. Hopwood was quite firm that she had found it unlocked and had not touched it. The windows presented a more complicated picture. The library had 3 windows, 2 overlooking the east garden, which were latched from within and showed no signs of disturbance, and 1 narrow casement on the north wall that faced the stone passage between the main house and the old servants' wing. This window's latch was found in the closed position, but Sergeant Fellows noticed, with the gratified air of a man who has found something useful, that the latch had a worn catch. It could be pushed closed from outside if the window were pulled firmly shut, without the pin engaging properly. In theory, someone could have entered or exited through this window and made it appear secured. In practice, the window was narrow. Dr. Norwood, at 6 feet and broad across the shoulders, could not have managed it. Constance Blackwood, erect and dignified, was asked by Fellows, rather tentatively, whether she thought she could fit through such a gap, and replied with a look that silenced him for some time. The household was assembled in the drawing-room while the library was examined. They sat in a configuration that expressed, without words, exactly how they felt about one another. Constance occupied the central chair nearest the fire, upright and self-contained. Philippa sat beside her mother, too close for comfort, and kept reaching for James Norwood's hand, which he provided with quiet steadiness. Arabella Fenchurch sat alone near the window, her hands folded in her lap, watching Inspector Marsh with the cool attention of someone assessing an instrument's reliability. Mr. Fitch sat in the corner, his brown leather case on his knees, and appeared to be making himself as small as geometrically possible. Marsh interviewed each of them briefly and came away, Fellows later remarked, looking like a man who has been given a jigsaw puzzle with no picture on the box. Everyone had retired between 11 and 11:30. No one had heard anything unusual during the night, a claim that the storm made plausible but not provable. No one admitted to returning to the library, to hearing Reginald's door, or to knowing of any reason why someone might wish him dead. This last point was received with a collective stillness that told Marsh more than any answer might have. By 10 o'clock, word had reached York, and by 11, London. It was from London, specifically from Inspector Japp of Scotland Yard, who was in the area on entirely unrelated business in Harrogate, that the name arrived. "You want Poirot," Japp said, on the telephone, with the resignation of a man who has said the same sentence many times. "Queer little Belgian. Don't let him irritate you. He'll annoy you thoroughly, and then he'll tell you exactly who did it. I've sent him a wire." Marsh, who had not asked for Japp's opinion, thanked him politely. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, a small, immaculately dressed man with a remarkable moustache descended from a hired motor car in front of Blackwood Manor, looked up at the facade with bright, intelligent eyes, and observed to his companion, a tall, pleasant-faced man in a tweed coat, that the house had the atmosphere of a place where secrets had been kept for a very long time. "Seems like a perfectly ordinary old manor to me, Poirot," said Captain Hastings. Hercule Poirot smiled. "Précisément, mon ami. That is exactly what concerns me." Chapter 3. Poirot studies the canvas. Hercule Poirot did not, as Inspector Marsh might have hoped, immediately examine the crime scene. He stood in the entrance hall for 3 full minutes without moving, his head slightly tilted, his eyes travelling across the panelled walls, the hunting trophies, the worn Turkey carpet, the angle of afternoon light through the mullioned window, and the face of Mrs. Hopwood, the housekeeper, who stood before him with the solid composure of a woman who has decided to withhold judgment. "You found the body, Madame Hopwood," said Poirot. "I did, sir. And you called the police before you told anyone in the household?" Mrs. Hopwood paused a fraction of a second, the pause of someone who has not expected the first question to be the precise one that mattered. "I did, sir. I thought it best." "Why best?" Another pause. "Because whoever done it was still in the house." Poirot regarded her with warm approval. "You are a most logical woman, madame. I am delighted to meet you." He removed his overcoat with great deliberateness, handed it to the young constable who was hovering nearby, and turned to Hastings. "Come, my friend, let us first see the room, and then the people. The room does not lie. The people, that is another matter entirely." The library was a long, low-ceilinged room, lined on 3 walls with dark oak shelves. The books were old and well-used, not the decorative kind, and there were gaps where volumes had been recently removed and not replaced. A large partner's desk stood at the far end, facing the door. Reginald Blackwood's body had been removed, but the chair remained precisely as it had been found, and Poirot studied it for a long moment. "He was seated when he died," Poirot said, "or he sat down after being struck, which is possible, but less probable. The wound, I am told, was to the front of the chest. He faced his killer. He was not running, not fighting, not taken from behind. He sat. He turned to look at the fireplace, and someone lit a fire. Could have been Reginald himself," Hastings offered. "Could have been, but observe the armchair near the fireplace, Hastings, not the desk chair. 2 indentations in the cushion, quite fresh. The desk chair has only the impression of the dead man. So at some point during the evening, 2 people sat before that fire." Hastings studied the armchair, which showed, he had to admit, the distinct compression of 2 people having used it, one on each arm, or one reclining while another perched. "They were talking," Hastings said. "Reginald met someone in here, or invited someone, or was invited by someone. The fire was a social fire, mon ami, not the hasty fire of a man alone and cold. Someone planned to be comfortable." Poirot moved to the desk. The blank page with its 3 words, "He knew everything," had been removed as evidence, but he had seen Marsh's photograph of it. He stood where the sheet had lain and looked at the surface of the desk, which was otherwise tidy, a blotter, an inkstand, a small tray of correspondence, all undisturbed. "The paper was placed there for us to find," Poirot said quietly. "It was not left accidentally, not dropped in a struggle. It was set down with intention. The killer wished us to think in a particular direction." He picked up the inkstand and examined it. The ink in the well was dry at the edges, old ink, not recently disturbed. But the message was not written here. The ink is different, a bluer black, rather than this brownish tone. The paper was written elsewhere and brought to the room. He crossed to the north window. The latch, as Fellows had noted, was worn. Poirot examined it with a small magnifying glass, then leaned close and studied the sill, which showed a faint trace of dampness and, at the outer edge, where the stone met the iron frame, a thread of dark wool, barely 3/4 of an inch long, caught on a rough corner. He did not remove it, he simply noted it and straightened up. "The window is possible," he said, "but I do not yet know if it is true. Possibility and truth are very different creatures." He turned and surveyed the room once more. "Now, Hastings, the people." They were still assembled in the drawing-room, the atmosphere having grown considerably more strained in the 4 hours since the discovery. Tea had been brought and largely ignored. Mr. Fitch had been permitted to use the morning-room telephone and had made several calls to his office, which seemed to agitate him. Philippa Norwood had cried, quietly and persistently, since mid-morning. Poirot entered the drawing-room with what Hastings privately thought of as his best manner, that air of mild, courteous interest, slightly foreign, entirely unthreatening, which had caused so many guilty people to relax, precisely when they ought not to have done. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said pleasantly, "forgive the intrusion. I am Hercule Poirot. I have been asked to assist the investigation. I wish only to speak with each of you a little, informally, you understand. Not an interrogation, merely a conversation." Constance Blackwood looked at him with the direct gaze she gave to everything. "I have heard of you, Mem Poirot. I believe you are rather good." "I try, madame, I try." He settled himself into a chair, the best chair in the room, as was his invariable custom, and folded his small hands together. "And now, tell me about Reginald. Not how he died, how he lived." What followed was, Hastings thought rather masterful. Poirot asked almost nothing directly. He made small observations about the room, the portraits, the quality of the light, and people found themselves talking around those observations, expanding them, correcting him, filling in details he had seemed merely to speculate about. Within 40 minutes, without appearing to interrogate anyone, Poirot had established 3 things that Marsh had not. First, Reginald had made a telephone call at 9:30 the previous evening, after dinner, from the telephone in the hallway, which was audible from the library door. No one admitted to having heard his conversation, but Arabella Fenchurch's expression shifted, for just a moment, when the call was mentioned. Second, the will, which Mr. Fitch was to have read this morning, had apparently been the subject of a private conversation between Reginald and Constance during the late afternoon. What was said, Constance declined to specify. What it concerned, Poirot could guess. Third, Philippa Norwood's husband, the composed Dr. Norwood, had not been in bed when Philip awoke at approximately midnight to find the storm had shifted and the bedroom window had blown open. He had been absent, she said carefully, for perhaps 20 minutes. He had returned cold, she said. She had assumed, she said, that he had gone downstairs for water. Dr. Norwood, meeting Poirot's pleasantly curious gaze, agreed that this was precisely what he had done. Poirot nodded, smiled, and suggested they might all benefit from some rest before dinner. "Well," said Hastings, once they were in the corridor, "Norwood's lying." "Perhaps," said Poirot, "or perhaps he simply has a reason to let his wife believe he is lying. The two are not the same thing, Hastings, and it is remarkable how often people forget it." Chapter 4. Conversations at the Edge of Truth. Poirot had always maintained that the most revealing interviews were those which did not resemble interviews at all. The formal question and answer, with its procedural solemnity, put people on guard. They rehearsed answers, chose words carefully, and gave you, at best, a polished surface. What Poirot preferred was the conversation that arrived sideways, begun about something harmless and moved, by small degrees, toward the thing that mattered. He spoke with Arabella Fenchurch first, at her request, which itself told him something. She came to the morning room at 4 o'clock, with the air of a woman who has decided that the best defence is a controlled offence. "You wish to speak with me about Reginald," she said, before Poirot had invited her to sit. "I wish to speak with you about many things, Mademoiselle Fenchurch. Please." He gestured to the chair across from him. "You knew Sir Edmund better than anyone, I think. I served him loyally for 14 years. Loyally, yes. And Reginald, how did you find him?" Arabella's posture did not change, but something in her eyes sharpened fractionally. Reginald was his father's son in appearance, and his father's opposite in character. Sir Edmund was a man of principle, however imperfect. Reginald was a man of appetite. An honest assessment. "I am generally honest about the dead. There seems little point in dishonesty now." Poirot tilted his head. "You heard him make a telephone call last evening, at 9:30. A brief pause, not quite a flicker, but something. I heard him in the hallway. Yes, I was coming down to fetch a book I had left in the library." "And did you hear what was said?" "I heard him say, and I am quoting precisely, M. Poirot, 'I know what you did, and I will use it.'" And then a pause, and then, "I think you'll find my terms perfectly reasonable." He did not hear me. I returned upstairs without my book. Poirot regarded her steadily. "You did not tell the inspector this. Inspector Marsh did not ask the right question. And you waited to tell me." "I waited to see what kind of man you were." She met his gaze without apology. "Now I have decided." Poirot permitted himself a small smile. "Tell me, mademoiselle," this voice. Reginald was speaking to someone on the telephone. "Did you have any sense, any impression at all, of who that someone might be?" Arabella was quiet for a moment. "He said one word that struck me as odd. Before he mentioned terms, he said a name, not a surname, a given name. He said, "Don't be tedious, James." The name settled between them in the quiet room. "I see," said Poirot. "Thank you, Mademoiselle Fenchurch. You have been most helpful. Precise, clear, and remarkably brave." Arabella stood. "I liked Reginald very little, but he deserves to have the truth told. So does this family." She paused at the door. "Whatever the truth turns out to be." When she had gone, Hastings, who had been sitting unobtrusively in the corner with his notebook, looked up. "James, that's Norwood. There are other Jameses in England, Hastings. But Norwood was the one who wasn't in bed at midnight. "Indeed he was not." Poirot steepled his fingers. "And yet, Reginald made that call at 9:30. If Norwood was his target, why was he still alive at midnight? Why a social fire, a conversation? A man being blackmailed does not generally sit comfortably by the fire with his blackmailer, unless he was waiting for the right moment. Or unless," said Poirot softly, "Norwood was not the only person Reginald called James." He rose and smoothed his coat. "Come, let us speak with the doctor." Dr. James Norwood received them in the small sitting room adjacent to the bedroom he shared with Philippa. He was, Hastings thought, the most controlled person he had encountered in some time. Not cold, precisely, but contained, in the way that a very precise piece of machinery is contained. He offered tea, which they declined, and sat with his hands loosely resting on his knees. "You want to know about last night," he said. "I want to know about many things," said Poirot pleasantly, "but we may begin there." Norwood was quiet for a moment. "I went downstairs at approximately midnight. Not for water. I apologize for that. I said it in front of Philippa, and I didn't wish to alarm her. I went because I couldn't sleep, and I wanted to check whether the library was occupied." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Why would the library be occupied at midnight?" "Because Reginald had sent me a note, slipped under our door some time after dinner. It asked me to come to the library at midnight. It said there was something important to discuss regarding the will." "And you went?" "I went at 12:30. I was late, I admit. I was trying to decide whether to go at all." He paused. "When I arrived, the library door was open. The fire was low. Reginald was in the chair at the desk. He was dead. The room was very quiet." "You found the body?" said Poirot, in a tone of mild surprise. "I found the body, yes. And you said nothing." Norwood looked at him directly. "I panicked. I know how it looks. A doctor panicking is absurd. But I stood there, and I looked at him and I thought, I was summoned here. I was late. Someone sent me that note, M. Poirot, and that same someone killed Reginald Blackwood, and I thought that if I reported finding the body, I would be exactly where the killer wished me to be." "The note," said Poirot. "You have it still?" "I burned it," said Norwood, "which I now understand was the worst thing I could have done." "It was not ideal," Poirot agreed. "But tell me, this note, was it handwritten?" "Typed. On a small piece of paper. Unsigned." Poirot nodded slowly. Hastings could see the thoughts moving behind those extraordinary eyes, ordering and connecting. "One more question, Doctor. When you entered the library, the body, the fire, was there anything on the desk?" Norwood met his gaze. "There was a sheet of paper. I didn't touch it. I couldn't read it clearly in the low light, but there was something written on it." He paused. 3 words, I think." "Thank you," said Poirot, and he meant it entirely. Chapter 5. What the Will Contains. Mr. Gerald Fitch had been a solicitor for 31 years, and had acquired, in that time, the particular stillness of a man who has witnessed every variety of human behaviour at its most mercenary, and has made his peace with it. He met Poirot in the morning room at 5 o'clock, with his brown leather case on the table and his hands folded on top of it, a posture that said clearly, "I will tell you what I must, and nothing I need not." "M. Fitch," said Poirot, settling into the chair opposite, with his characteristic neat economy of movement. "The will. It is at the centre of this, I think." "It may be." Sir Edmund revised it. "When?" 6 weeks ago. Fitch paused. He was quite specific that the revision was to remain private until the reading. And yet Reginald knew something of its contents. He made a telephone call last evening suggesting he possessed information of value. He had spoken with Madame Blackwood privately during the afternoon. One concludes that the will's contents were not entirely secret. Fitch looked uncomfortable in the measured way of a man who is prepared for discomfort. I cannot speak to what Reginald knew, or believed he knew. I can tell you what the will actually says. Please. Fitch opened his case and removed a document. The estate, Blackwood Manor and its contents, passes entirely to Mrs. Constance Blackwood in perpetuity, with the provision that it transfer to Philippa Norwood upon Constance's death. Reginald Blackwood receives a legacy of £2,000 and nothing further. Hastings made a small involuntary sound. Poirot did not move. £2,000, Poirot said. From an estate of what value? The manor and grounds alone represent perhaps 400,000. There are additional investments. Fitch folded his hands. The previous will had divided the estate between Reginald and Philippa equally, with a life interest to Constance. So Reginald lost everything. Substantially, yes. And he knew this. Fitch hesitated. He came to see me in York 3 weeks ago. He asked me directly whether he remained a principal beneficiary. I told him that I was not at liberty to disclose the contents prior to the reading. He was not pleased. He understood the implication of your refusal. I believe he drew conclusions. Yes. Poirot studied the fire for a moment. M. Fitch, the revision. Was it Sir Edmund's own wish, expressed clearly and freely in your professional judgment? A longer pause this time. Sir Edmund was quite firm. The instruction came from him directly, in writing, followed by an appointment in which he was alone and entirely coherent. I have no professional reason to question the validity of the document, but a personal one. Fitch looked at him. Sir Edmund said to me, at the conclusion of our appointment, that he had learned something which had fundamentally altered his opinion of his son. He did not tell me what that something was. He seemed not angry, grieved, deeply and quietly grieved. Poirot was silent for a moment. I see. Tell me, was there any provision for Miss Arabella Fenchurch? £5,000, left privately and not to be mentioned at the reading. A generous sum. Sir Edmund valued loyalty. He did, said Poirot. I am beginning to think it is a quality that runs through this entire matter like a vein through stone. He rose, thanked Fitch with great courtesy, and walked with Hastings to the corridor. Reginald knew, Hastings said. He knew he'd been cut out. He was furious. And he was trying to blackmail someone. But who? And over what? The what is perhaps the most interesting question, Poirot said. Reginald told someone on the telephone, I know what you did. Not, I know who you are, or I know your secret. What you did, an action. A specific act. He paused beside the portrait of Sir Edmund, which hung in the corridor between the morning room and the library. A formal painting, the subject appearing dignified and somewhat sorrowful. Sir Edmund learned something about his son that caused him to grieve, that caused him to rewrite his will. That something, I think, is the same something that Reginald believed gave him power over another person. That doesn't quite make sense, does it? Hastings frowned. If Reginald had done something terrible, wouldn't that be the reason to cut him from the will, not a secret he could use against someone else? Ah, said Poirot, but you are assuming that Reginald's secret and his father's discovery are the same secret. What if Reginald, in the course of doing whatever he did, had stumbled upon the secret of someone else entirely? Hastings worked through this. So Sir Edmund found out about Reginald's behaviour, cut him from the will, and Reginald, scrambling for money or revenge, discovered something about another member of the household and decided to use it. It is a hypothesis, said Poirot, but a very interesting one. And someone, Hastings, someone in this house, decided that Reginald's knowledge was too dangerous to be permitted to continue. Chapter 6. The thread on the windowsill. The following morning arrived clear and cold, the moors visible through every window as a sweep of brown and purple under a pale sky. Poirot had been awake since 5, which was unusual for him, and Hastings found him in the library at 7, standing before the north window with his magnifying glass and an expression of precise concentration. "You've found something," Hastings said. "I have confirmed something," Poirot corrected. "Which is better. Look here, Hastings." He indicated the windowsill. The dark wool thread was there, as Fellows had noted, caught on the rough iron corner of the frame. Poirot had not disturbed it, but he was pointing not to the thread itself but to the stone surface of the sill, which in the morning light revealed a detail invisible the day before. 2 faint impressions in the thin film of dust that coated the inner stone, each approximately 3 inches long, slightly curved at one end. "Fingertips," said Hastings. "The fingertips of 2 hands gripping the inner sill. Someone came in through this window, Hastings. Not out, in. The grip is inward pulling." Poirot straightened. "And this person, entering from the passage, was wearing dark wool. The thread is a fine worsted, good quality, not a labouring person's garment. But the window is too narrow for Norwood." "For Norwood, yes, and for Reginald himself, who was a large man. It would admit Philippa Norwood quite easily. Or Constance Blackwood, who is slender despite her carriage. Or Arabella Fenchurch." He paused. "Or a person as yet unaccounted for." "You think there's someone we haven't considered?" "I think there are always possibilities we have not yet considered. It is the distinguishing feature of the early stages of an investigation." He moved away from the window and sat at the desk, where he spread his small notebook open before him. He had been writing in it since the previous evening, in his precise handwriting, and the pages were covered with names, times, and arrows connecting observations. "Let us order what we know," he said. "Reginald Blackwood was killed between midnight and 2 in the morning. He was seated at this desk, facing his killer. There was a fire, a social fire, suggesting prior company or a planned meeting. Dr. Norwood received a typed note summoning him to this room at midnight and arrived at 12:30 to find the body already dead. Someone entered through the north window from the passage. The note on the desk, he knew everything, was written elsewhere and placed here deliberately. "To point us in the wrong direction," Hastings said, "or in the right one. The question is, did the killer write that note to mislead us, or to confess something?" Poirot tapped his notebook. "The telephone call. Reginald spoke to a James at 9:30, spoke of knowing what you did, and mentioned terms. This suggests blackmail, recent blackmail, hastily conceived, perhaps panicked. Why panicked? Because a careful blackmailer does not operate at a family gathering the evening before a will reading. A careful blackmailer chooses his moment. Reginald made that call within hours of learning, or confirming, that he had been largely excluded from his father's estate. He was not operating from a position of careful strategy. He was operating from desperation. Hastings considered this. So he panicked, made a clumsy approach, and the person he was trying to blackmail decided the simplest solution was to remove Reginald permanently, yes. And that removal was, in contrast to the blackmail, quite carefully planned. The typed note to Norwood, to provide an alternative suspect, discovered at the scene. The fire, to suggest a comfortable meeting, obscuring the nature of the encounter. The planted message on the desk, to introduce an element of dramatic ambiguity. Poirot closed his notebook. "This is not a crime of passion, Hastings. The blackmail was impulsive, but the murder was organized, which means the killer, upon receiving Reginald's approach, responded with alarm, but also with remarkable swiftness and clarity of thought. Someone intelligent. Very. And, here is what strikes me most, someone who knew this house. The north passage, the worn window latch, the typed note left under Norwood's door, the letter opener on the desk, not brought from outside but taken from this desk where it always lived. This was an act committed by someone entirely familiar with Blackwood Manor. They sat with this for a moment, Constance, Hastings said eventually. Or Arabella, said Poirot. Or Philippa, who grew up here. Or even Norwood, who has been visiting for 6 years of marriage. He rose. I am not yet ready to name a killer. I am ready to lay a small trap. But first, there is something I need to verify, and it requires a visit to the village of Harcastle. What are you looking for in Harcastle? A pharmacist, said Poirot, and the records of a particular transaction that took place approximately 14 months ago. Chapter 7. The Doctor's Shadow. Harcastle was a market town of modest ambitions and long memory. Its high street contained a butcher, a baker, 2 public houses, a small post office, and a chemist's shop called Purvis & Son, that had been dispensing remedies and recording prescriptions in the same ledger format since 1887. Mr. Purvis the younger, who was 64 and only nominally a son, received Poirot with the wariness of a man accustomed to maintaining medical confidentiality and the visible fascination of a man who read detective fiction. "You'll understand I cannot simply," he began. "Of course," said Poirot, at his most sympathetic. "I would not dream of asking you to violate professional confidence. I ask only a yes or no answer to a single question. If the answer is yes, I shall say nothing further, and you may trust me with that entirely. If the answer is no, I apologize for the intrusion, and we part as friends." Purvis regarded him. "One question. Is it possible that a prescription was filled here, approximately a year ago, for a controlled substance, a sedative or narcotic, under circumstances that caused you any personal concern?" The silence lasted 4 seconds. "Yes," said Mr. Purvis. "Thank you," said Poirot. "That is all." In the hired car returning to the manor, Hastings tried 3 times to ask what Poirot had deduced from this exchange, and was given, each time, the small, amiable smile that meant the question would not yet be answered. What Poirot said instead was, "Tell me about Philippa Norwood, Hastings." "Your impression of her?" Hastings considered. "Nervous, emotional, very fond of her husband, perhaps more than he appears fond of her, or perhaps he's simply less demonstrative. She grew up here, obviously feels the weight of the house and the family. She seems genuinely shocked by Reginald's death. Does she seem afraid?" Hastings looked at him sharply. "Afraid of what? Of anyone in particular?" Hastings thought back over the hours in the drawing room, the meals eaten in constrained silence, the small social geometries of where people chose to sit. "She avoids looking at Arabella Fenchurch," he said slowly. "I noticed it, but thought it was just an old family tension, Arabella having been close to Sir Edmund, and Philippa being his daughter by Constance." "And Arabella, how does she look at Philippa?" Hastings thought. "She doesn't," he said. "She simply doesn't look at her at all." "2 people who are careful not to share a glance," said Poirot thoughtfully, "and yet who have lived in close proximity for many years. That is not merely discomfort, Hastings. That is the careful maintenance of a boundary, a pact of silence." "About what?" "That," said Poirot, "is the question I intend to answer this evening." They returned to the manor to find that the afternoon had not been uneventful. Inspector Marsh, in a fit of procedural energy, had searched the bedroom occupied by Reginald Blackwood, and had found, in the lining of a leather briefcase, a collection of papers that he had not yet fully examined. He handed them to Poirot with the controlled resentment of a man who knows he is out of his depth, and has decided to be gracious about it. The papers were letters, 11 of them, in various handwritings, spanning a period of about 2 years. Several were unremarkable: business correspondence, notes from his bank, a letter from a woman in London whose relationship to Reginald was expressed in terms that suggested both intimacy and financial dependency. But 3 letters were different in character. They were unsigned, they were short, and they were clearly written in response to demands, precisely the kind of demands that Reginald had made by telephone the previous evening, except these were older, colder, and evidently not resolved. Poirot read them twice, then laid them on the desk. "Well?" said Hastings. "Well," said Poirot, "Reginald Blackwood was a blackmailer of some experience. This was not a new occupation." He looked at the letters. "These responses, all three, are addressed to R. They speak of arrangements made, payments discussed, warnings given." He paused. "Two of the letters are in the same hand. The third is different. Different person. Different person." So Reginald had at least two sources of income of this nature. He lifted one of the similar-handed letters to the light. "This handwriting, have you encountered it anywhere in the house, Hastings?" Hastings thought of the letter opener, the correspondence tray on the library desk, the note that Norwood claimed to have received and burned. "I can't say. I can," said Poirot. "I have been looking at handwriting in this house since I arrived. It is one of the things one notices, if one pays attention to how people write their names in registers, how they address household lists." He set the letter down. "This hand, these two letters, belong to Arabella Fenchurch." Chapter 8. The Weight of Old Devotion. He came to her after dinner, which was a brief and painfully polite affair, and asked if he might speak with her privately. Arabella Fenchurch looked at him for a long moment, then rose from her chair without a word and led him to the small sitting room at the east end of the house, the one that looked out onto the walled garden, where the last of the autumn roses were barely visible in the darkness. She sat down and folded her hands in her lap. "You've found the letters." "I have found two of them, mademoiselle. Two letters to R, in your handwriting, discussing terms of payment. How many were there in total?" 7. She said it without flinching. "Over 18 months, beginning shortly after Sir Edmund died. Reginald began to approach you after his father's death. Within 3 months, he had found something among his father's papers after the estate was sorted." She looked at the window, at the darkness beyond. "Sir Edmund kept everything. It was both his great quality and, as it turned out, his greatest danger to me." Poirot waited. He had learned long ago that silence, properly held, was more effective than any question. "Before Sir Edmund's decline," Arabella said, "before he became ill, we were close, more than a secretary and employer. I do not speak of this lightly, but I loved him, in a way that was not entirely proper, and which he returned in a way that was also not entirely proper, and which we had both, by tacit agreement, kept entirely private." She paused. "He was a man of principle, Monsieur Poirot. He felt the weight of what we were to each other very deeply. He wrote to me letters, private letters. He also wrote of it in a private journal. We agreed the letters would be destroyed, but Sir Edmund, who destroyed nothing, had kept them. And Reginald found them. Reginald found the journal. The letters, I believe, he found among a different collection. He came to me 6 weeks after the funeral with a smile I will not describe, and he suggested that such material, widely shared, would cause considerable embarrassment to me, to Constance, to Philippa, to Sir Edmund's memory. Her voice was entirely steady. He suggested a monthly sum that was substantial for a person in my position. You paid. I paid. I depleted my savings, and then I began to borrow, quietly, where I could. A brief compression of her lips. And when Reginald called me last Thursday, before this gathering, to say that in view of his changing financial circumstances, he intended to revise the terms upward, I told him I could not pay. He said he would be in touch. A pause. He was in touch, as you know, during the telephone call. He increased the sum substantially. "And that evening," said Poirot gently, "what did you do?" Arabella looked at him steadily. "I went to the library at 11:30. I knocked. He was alive, Monsieur Poirot. He was at the desk, alive, and we argued. He was dismissive and contemptuous, and I was angrier than I have ever been in my life. I told him that I would go to the police before I paid another penny, that the scandal would harm me, but it would harm the family's reputation equally, and that he had, in my estimation, dishonoured his father's memory more thoroughly than any letter ever could. And then," And then I left. He was alive when I left. I did not touch the letter opener. I did not harm him. She met Poirot's eyes without wavering. I am telling you this because I was there, and you are going to find that out, and I would rather you heard it from me truthfully than constructed it from evidence. Poirot studied her for a long moment. The fire was lit when you arrived. Yes, already burning. Was there another person in the room? No. But I had the impression, the very distinct impression, that someone had recently left. The second armchair was slightly out of position. There was a glass on the table beside it. One glass, not two. Reginald had been talking with someone before you arrived, said Poirot. I believe so, yes. Poirot rose. Mademoiselle Fenchurch, you have placed yourself at the scene. You have given yourself both motive and opportunity. You understand that this is, potentially, very damaging to your position. I understand perfectly, but you are telling me the truth. I am telling you the truth. Poirot inclined his head with great respect. Then I believe you, not because innocence always speaks honestly. It does not. But because the detail you have given me about the glass, the moved chair, the fire already lit, these details do not serve you. A guilty woman would have simplified her account. You are making it more complicated, which is what the truth invariably does. He paused at the door. The letters Reginald held. Were they written by Sir Edmund or by you? Both. Where are they now? I don't know. I never saw them again, after Reginald showed them to me once. She looked down at her hands. I have been afraid, Monsieur Poirot, for 18 months, of precisely this moment. It is not unpleasant in a strange way to have it arrive. The truth, said Poirot gently, is always a relief. Eventually. Chapter 9. Portraits of a Marriage. It was 9:30 when Poirot knocked softly at the door of the room where Philippa Norwood had retreated after dinner. Hastings waited in the corridor. There was a long pause, then Philippa's voice carefully composed. Come in. She was sitting by the window in the dark, or rather in the near dark. A single lamp burned behind her, illuminating the side of her face and the tense, precise way she held her shoulders. She looked younger in the lamplight, and frightened in the way that exhausted people become frightened. Not dramatically, but deeply, like water that has saturated stone. Mrs. Norwood, said Poirot, sitting down with his customary quiet care. I will not pretend that this conversation is easy, but I think you know that it is necessary. I know, she said. Your husband, she was quiet. He received a note summoning him to the library at midnight. He went at 12:30. He found the body. He said nothing because he feared implication. Poirot paused. This is what he told me. What would you add? Philippa turned to look at him. Her eyes were dry. She had, it seemed, finished with tears. James is a good man. He is a careful man. Careful in ways that I sometimes find suffocating and sometimes find deeply reassuring. She looked back at the window. He told me about the note this afternoon. He hadn't told me before. He sat down and told me everything, and I sat and listened and said nothing. Why did he keep it from you initially? Because he knew what I would think. Her voice was very controlled. Because there is a reason someone chose James to be found at that scene. And James knows it, and I know it, and I suspect, Poirot, that you are beginning to know it as well. Tell me. She was quiet for a moment. 14 months ago, a patient of James's died, in Harrogate. A patient under his care for a chronic condition, a man of 68 with a weak heart who had been deteriorating for some time. The death was recorded as natural. She paused. James had treated him for 2 years. The man had made some changes to his affairs in the last months of his life. Changes that affected his family's inheritance significantly. Changes in whose favour? Philippa looked at him. In favour of a charitable trust. A medical research trust. One which James had recommended to him. A breath. James did nothing wrong. I have told myself that many times, and I believe it. The patient made free choices. The death was natural. The inquest found no irregularity. She folded her hands. But Reginald had somehow heard something. From someone he contacted James privately 2 months ago and suggested that an anonymous report to the General Medical Council might raise questions that, even unanswered, could destroy a reputation. So Reginald was blackmailing your husband. Threatening to. The calls began. James refused to pay. He called Reginald's bluff. And then this gathering was announced, and Reginald became more aggressive. She met Poirot's eyes. Reginald called James that evening, the 9:30 call you will have heard about, and said his terms had changed, that he needed a larger immediate payment. He said if James agreed, he would come to the library at 11 to finalize it. And what did your husband decide? He decided to go and tell Reginald that there was nothing to find and no payment would be made, and that if Reginald wished to ruin himself publicly by making false allegations, that was his choice. She paused. He went to the library at 11:15, not at midnight, earlier than he told you. The room was very still. He arrived at 11:15, said Poirot quietly. And what did he find? He found Reginald alive. He had his conversation. He told me Reginald laughed at him, genuinely laughed, and said he thought James was bluffing. James left at approximately 11:45. Reginald was, at that point, alive and drinking brandy. Why did he not tell me this? Philippa looked at her hands. Because the note delivered under our door, the one summoning him to the library at midnight, was not what he told you. He did describe it correctly. It was typed, it was signed with an initial. But the initial was not, as he implied, from Reginald. The initial was P, a note telling him to come to the library at midnight, signed P. She looked up. Which is, M. Poirot, the initial of my name. Poirot was very still. He thought, said Philippa, that I had sent it. He didn't know why. He didn't ask me. He simply wondered. And it made everything he knew complicated, and he chose to simplify when he spoke to you. Did you send that note? No, she said. I did not. Chapter 10. The Ordered Mind. Poirot sat in his room for 2 hours after his conversation with Philippa Norwood, and Hastings, who looked in twice, found him both times in the same position, upright in the chair by the desk, his hands folded on the table, his eyes fixed on the middle distance with the concentrated stillness of a man performing very complex work. At midnight, Poirot sent a brief note by Mrs. Hopwood to each member of the household, requesting their presence in the drawing-room at 10 o'clock the following morning. He then opened his notebook and wrote for 45 minutes without stopping. Hastings, who shared a room adjacent, heard the pen scratching and resisted, with some effort, the temptation to knock and ask. In the morning, Poirot was at breakfast at 8, immaculately dressed, and consumed his egg with the serene concentration of a man who has settled a great matter and is now free to appreciate small pleasures. He spoke of the Yorkshire countryside, of the quality of the marmalade, and of an article he had read on the train about the migration patterns of swallows. He said nothing about the case. Hastings endured this for 20 minutes. Poirot. Yes, mon ami. You know, don't you? Poirot considered his toast. I have a hypothesis which is consistent with every fact I have established. This morning's gathering will either confirm it or introduce a complication I have not yet foreseen. He spread marmalade with geometric precision. I do not anticipate a complication. You're confident. I am methodical. Which is better than confident? Confidence is an emotion. Method is a process. He set down his knife. Let me tell you, Hastings, not who did it, not yet, because the order of revelation matters, but what the case is, what it is truly about. Hastings leaned forward. This is a case about knowing, said Poirot. About what people know and what they believe others know, and what they will do to control that knowledge. Reginald Blackwood was killed not because of what he had done, though he had done considerable harm, but because of what he knew, or was believed to know. The note on the desk said, "He knew everything." That is a true statement, but it was written by the killer to mean something specific, to direct our attention, and it happens also to be a kind of epitaph. Reginald really did know everything, about everyone in the house. He knew about Arabella Fenchurch and her payments. He knew about James Norwood and his patient. He knew about his exclusion from the will. And he knew, or had very recently discovered, one further thing. The most dangerous thing. The thing that caused someone to act with such speed, such intelligence, and such ruthlessness. What thing? Poirot was quiet for a moment. Sir Edmund Blackwood did not rewrite his will simply because he was disappointed in Reginald. He rewrote it because he discovered something that caused him, as Mr. Fitch said, deep grief. Not the behaviour of a son he had always somewhat known to be flawed. Something new, something that shifted the entire foundation of what he understood his family to be. What could be that significant? Something concerning not Reginald but someone else. He rose and smoothed his coat. "Come, Hastings, let us go and lay out the truth." Chapter 11. The Drawing Room, 10 o'clock. They were all present. Constance Blackwood in her chair before the fire, exactly as she had been on the first evening, upright and composed. Philippa Norwood sat beside her mother, but not close. She had moved her chair slightly apart, which was new. Dr. Norwood stood near the window, and for the first time since Poirot's arrival he looked, genuinely, afraid. Arabella Fenchurch sat in her customary place near the east wall, her hands folded, her face calm with the calm of someone who has prepared themselves for whatever is coming. Mr. Fitch occupied his corner, his brown case closed and on the floor beside him. An adjustment, Poirot noted, from the defensive posture of holding it on his knees. Inspector Marsh stood near the door. He had been briefed by Poirot at 9 o'clock, and while he could not have said that he entirely followed the logic, he had followed it sufficiently to have a constable stationed outside. Poirot stood at the centre of the room, not at the hearth, not at the desk, but simply in the open space between the furniture, where everyone could see him and he could see everyone. "I thank you for coming," he said. "I will be as concise as the material permits." Conciseness in a case of this kind is sometimes difficult, because the truth is layered, and each layer must be lifted carefully if the whole is to be properly seen. He began, as was his practice, with what had seemed important and was not. The most obvious suspect in the death of Reginald Blackwood was Dr. James Norwood. He was summoned to the scene by a note. He found the body and concealed the discovery. He had been blackmailed. He lied in his first interview. He glanced at Norwood. "All of this is true. None of it makes you the killer, Doctor. Your first visit to the library, at 11:15, was real. Your discovery of the body at midnight was real. The note you received, signed with the initial P, was designed precisely to place you at the scene at the time most useful to the killer." Norwood's expression did not change, but the set of his shoulders shifted, minutely, as if something had released. The note was not written by Philippa Norwood, who did not know of the blackmail attempt until her husband told her yesterday afternoon. It was written and delivered by the killer, who knew that Norwood had visited Reginald privately at 11:15, and who wished to ensure that when Norwood was found to have been at the scene, it would appear damning. "But who besides James and Reginald knew about that meeting?" Philippa asked. "Someone who was present in the library before Norwood arrived," said Poirot. "Someone who was there, listening, and who left before Norwood entered at 11:15, but who knew precisely what had been discussed." He let this settle for a moment. "Let us speak of Arabella Fenchurch," he said. "Miss Fenchurch was being blackmailed by Reginald regarding private letters relating to her devotion to Sir Edmund. She went to the library at 11:30 and confronted Reginald. She found him alive. She found the room already used, a displaced chair, a single glass. She left him alive." He inclined his head toward her. "I believe every word of this account." Arabella met his gaze steadily. "And now," said Poirot, "let us speak of what Sir Edmund Blackwood discovered 6 weeks before he died." The room was utterly quiet. The fire clicked and settled. Constance Blackwood was married to Sir Edmund for 26 years. She managed this estate with great capability and genuine intelligence. She was, by any measure, a remarkable woman. Poirot turned to look at her directly. She was also, 26 years ago, in a position of considerable financial vulnerability. Her first marriage had failed, her own family's resources were depleted, and she came to Blackwood Manor as the second wife of a man whose principal heir was a grown son from a previous marriage. Constance's face showed nothing, not even the effort of showing nothing, simply that winter slate composure. Sir Edmund had investments, Poirot continued, investments managed by Reginald, poorly, as we have noted, but 14 months ago one particular investment was liquidated, quietly, without Edmund's direct authorization, and the funds were transferred through a series of accounts to a private holding company. The transfer was engineered to appear as a routine administrative adjustment. The holding company has one beneficial owner. He paused. Constance Blackwood. The word landed in the room like a stone in still water. Reginald discovered this, Poirot said. Not through financial acumen, through luck, through finding a document his father had not properly filed. He confronted Constance with this information the afternoon before his death, during the private conversation that Constance described to the inspector as being about the will. It was about the will, yes, but more specifically, it was about the fact that Sir Edmund had discovered this transfer, and that it was one of the reasons he had changed the will. Sir Edmund didn't cut Reginald out because he was disappointed in him, said Hastings slowly from his corner. He cut him out because, said Poirot, Reginald had told Sir Edmund what his wife had done, and Sir Edmund, grieved and privately shattered, had not confronted Constance. He was not that kind of man, but had quietly revised his will and confided in no one. When Reginald arrived at this gathering and learned, from Mr. Fitch's careful evasions, that he had been excluded substantially, he understood that his father had acted on the information. He had expected to be rewarded. Instead, he found himself disinherited. He went to Constance, said Dr. Norwood, his voice low. He told her he knew, and he asked for money. He asked for rather a great deal, said Poirot. And Constance Blackwood, who had managed this estate, who had protected its future, who had spent 26 years building something she intended to keep, made a decision. He turned fully to face her. You went to the library at 10:30, madame. Before Arabella, before Norwood. You and Reginald had your conversation, your second conversation, by the fire you lit yourself. When it became clear that he would not be dissuaded, that he intended to expose the transfer, to claim that the estate had been defrauded, to use this as leverage regardless of what it cost the family name, you picked up the letter opener from the desk. It was close to hand, it was familiar, it was silver and heavy, and it had sat on that desk for 30 years. Constance Blackwood looked at him, not through him, not past him, directly at him, with those slate eyes. You struck him from the front, said Poirot. He was seated, he did not rise in time. Afterward, you composed yourself. You have a remarkable capacity for that. And you placed the sheet of paper on the desk. You had written it before the gathering, against this eventuality. He knew everything. Then you left by the north window, which you know as you know every inch of this house, and you made your way back through the servants' passage. The wool thread, said Hastings, from her dark green cardigan, which she has not worn since that evening, said Poirot. The room waited. Constance Blackwood sat very still. Then, in a voice that was as composed as it had been at every moment since Poirot had arrived, she said, I built this house. I built everything in it. Edmund left it to crumble, and I held it together, year after year, and when a little money was moved to make certain things possible, I moved it. Reginald would have taken everything, not to build anything, but to spend it. She paused. He was going to destroy this family. And so you destroyed him first, said Poirot. A silence. Yes, said Constance Blackwood. Chapter 12. After the thunder. Inspector Marsh performed his duty with the quiet efficiency of a man who has been, finally, shown where to look, and does not intend to make a spectacle of the finding. Constance Blackwood was taken from the drawing-room without drama, which seemed appropriate. She walked to the police car as she had walked through every room of the manor for 26 years, with the straight back and measured step of someone who considers composure the highest form of dignity. Philippa Norwood did not watch from the window. She sat in the drawing-room for a long time afterward, her hands in her lap, her face wearing the particular expression of a person absorbing a truth that has altered the shape of everything they thought they knew. Dr. Norwood sat beside her, and for once said nothing. He simply remained, which was perhaps the most useful thing. Arabella Fenchurch stood in the corridor when the car pulled away, and she stood there for several minutes alone. When she finally turned, Poirot was nearby. She looked at him with those clear, assessing eyes. "The letters," she said. "Reginald's copies. Inspector Marsh will locate them in the estate papers. I would expect him to exercise discretion." He paused. "He is, I think, a sensible man." "And Sir Edmund's reputation?" Poirot considered. "Sir Edmund's reputation will remain what it was. A man of principle, imperfect but genuine. What was between you and he was private, and the law has no interest in private affections." He inclined his head. "The money he left you, £5,000, was given with full knowledge and freely. It will not be contested." Arabella was quiet for a moment. "She moved that money to keep the house," she said. "To keep everything Sir Edmund built." "Yes. And in doing so she killed two things, a man and whatever remained of what Edmund built." "The paradox of certain desperate acts," said Poirot, "is that they destroy precisely what they attempt to preserve." She turned and walked back into the house, and Poirot let her go. Mr. Fitch was already in the morning-room, his case packed, his coat on, telephoning for a car to take him to the station. He paused when Poirot appeared in the doorway, receiver still in hand. "The will," said Fitch. "Under these circumstances, the will stands as written," said Poirot. "Constance is convicted of no crime yet. The law is patient. But the management of the estate, in the interim, will pass to the courts. Miss Philippa Norwood will have a great deal to manage." He paused. "Mr. Fitch, when Sir Edmund spoke of what he had learned and said he was grieved, did you understand at that time what it was?" Fitch looked at him steadily. "No. I knew something had altered his trust in the household. I did not know the specifics. But you were not entirely surprised this morning." A very careful pause. "I had wondered, in a general way, whether the estate's accounts fully reflected the estate's assets. But suspicion without evidence is merely imprecision." He closed his case. "I am a solicitor, M. Poirot, not a detective." "Indeed," said Poirot pleasantly. "It is a fortunate division of responsibilities." Chapter 13. Hastings considers the moors. That afternoon, while Poirot rested, he maintained, against all evidence of his stamina, that detection was exhausting. Hastings walked out onto the moors. The day had held clear since morning, and the October light was the particular low gold that makes the landscape appear both beautiful and inexorably temporary, as though the light itself knows it is counting down. He walked for an hour without thinking about anything very deliberately, which was, as Poirot had occasionally pointed out, Hastings's most effective mode of thought. He looked at the grass and the heather and the stone walls and the enormous sky, and he thought about Blackwood Manor, not about the crime, but about the people. He thought about Constance Blackwood, who had built something and tried to keep it, and had lost both it and herself in a single night's desperate action. He thought about Philippa, who was now heir to a manor, a legal proceeding, and a grief she had barely begun to measure. He thought about Dr. Norwood, whose reputation had been weaponized against him, and who had spent 2 days carrying a weight that might have crushed a less disciplined person. He thought about Arabella Fenchurch, who had loved a man for 14 years and then spent 18 months being punished for it, and who had told the truth at the first opportunity given to her by someone competent to hear it. And he thought about Reginald Blackwood, who had been a flawed man, a greedy man, a man who had made instruments of other people's pain, and who had died in a leather chair in a library that smelled of old books and dying fire, with a silver letter opener in his chest, and the peculiar dignity of the truly surprised. By the time he returned to the manor, the light had thinned to grey. Poirot was in the entrance hall, wearing his coat and looking precisely as he had looked when he arrived. Neat, self-contained, faintly amused by the world's persistent insistence on making itself complicated. "Ready?" said Hastings. "Ready," said Poirot. "Mrs. Hopwood has arranged a car. We catch the 7 o'clock from Harcastle." "It's a sad business," said Hastings after a moment. "All murder is sad. It is a waste of life, of possibility, of the remarkable human capacity for choosing otherwise." Poirot buttoned his coat with care. "What makes this one particularly sad is that it was a house full of intelligent people and private sufferings, and not one of them, not one, had confided honestly in another. If they had, the whole catastrophe might have been avoided. Do you think Constance could have been talked out of it? If someone had known," Poirot considered this genuinely, "I think she had convinced herself that she was protecting something greater than a life. When a person makes that calculation, they are very difficult to reach. She had lived with secrecy for so long that honesty had become, to her, a form of weakness." He looked back at the entrance hall, the panelling, the portraits, the worn Turkey carpet. "And the house, mon ami. The house did not help. Old houses full of old money and old silence. They have a way of making people believe that preservation is the highest virtue. It is not. It is merely the most seductive one." They went out into the evening. Chapter 14. The Little Grey Cells. Their car was not coming for 40 minutes. Hastings, with characteristic practicality, proposed the village pub. Poirot, with equally characteristic deliberateness, agreed. They sat in a corner of the snug at the Harcastle Arms. Low beams, good fire, a barman who did not recognise them and was therefore refreshingly indifferent, and Hastings had a whisky and Poirot had a tisane that the barman produced with a puzzlement he was too professional to express. "Tell me something," said Hastings. "The note, the one placed under Norwood's door, signed P. Constance, wrote that." "Yes. She knew Norwood had gone to the library that evening. She had heard his footsteps on the stair. She knew he had visited Reginald. After committing the murder, she returned to her room through the servants' passage, and she typed the note. There is a small typewriter in her sitting room. The typeface matches what Norwood described, and slipped it under his door. The intention was that when Norwood reported the body, the note would establish a second narrative, that Philippa had summoned her husband, which would implicate either Norwood or Philippa. It was very quick thinking. She is a very quick-thinking woman. This was both her strength and, ultimately, the signature that identified her. Hasty violence followed by meticulous concealment. It is a distinctive pattern. The violence was emotional. The meticulous work was Constance Blackwood at her truest. "When did you know?" Poirot turned his glass slowly on the table. "I began to seriously consider her at the moment I understood that the killer knew the house perfectly. The north window, the passage, the letter opener, the typewriter, these required not just familiarity, but native knowledge, someone who had always lived there. That narrowed it to Constance, Philippa, or Mrs. Hopwood, who had been employed since before Philippa's birth. Mrs. Hopwood, besides having no discernible motive, called the police before she informed the family. The act of a woman innocent, and more, the act of a woman of character, and you ruled out Philippa. Philippa Norwood is frightened. She was frightened before the murder, during it, and after. Fear is her dominant register. But it is a passive fear, the fear of someone who is affected by events around them, not the fear of someone who has created an event. The killer acted. Philippa, in all things, reacts. And Dr. Norwood couldn't fit through the window. Also, and this is perhaps more important, he called Reginald's bluff. A man who is genuinely prepared to call a blackmailer's bluff does not then kill him. He waits. He has chosen a strategy of resistance. If Norwood was going to commit violence, he would have done it 2 months ago, when the blackmail began. Hastings sat back. I keep coming back to the money. The transfer. Was it wrong what she did? I mean, she used Edmund's money without his knowledge, but she used it for the house, for the estate. It was wrong, said Poirot simply. It was not the worst wrong ever done, and she might have made it right if she had confessed to Edmund and asked his forgiveness. He was not, I think, an unforgiving man. But she did not confess, because confession requires the acknowledgement that one has been wrong, and Constance Blackwood had not allowed herself to be wrong for a very long time. He paused. She had managed so much for so long by her own lights that the idea of submitting her judgment to someone else's, even her husband's, had become intolerable. That is a very common trap for very capable people. Pride. Always, at the root, pride. Poirot turned his glass again. She did not kill Reginald because he was evil, though he had done evil things. She killed him because he would have exposed her, and she could not bear to be exposed. Not for her family's sake in the end, she told herself that. But it is the story we tell ourselves to justify what we cannot otherwise accept. She could not bear to be seen as having been wrong. The fire crackled. The barman polished a glass with a contemplativeness that suggested he found it more interesting than the customers. Do you ever feel sorry for them? Hastings asked. The killers. Poirot thought about this with his characteristic seriousness. Not performing consideration, but actually considering. I feel sorry for what they have become, he said finally. I feel sorry for the moment, which always exists, somewhere before the act, when a different choice was possible. Constance Blackwood was capable of love, of loyalty, of extraordinary competence. She was not born to this. She arrived at it by a series of decisions, each of which made the next decision slightly more inevitable. He folded his hands. This is the most frightening thing about human darkness, mon ami. It does not, as a rule, arrive whole. It accumulates. Hastings was quiet for a moment. Outside, the moors were entirely dark now, the sky sharp and cold with early stars. Poirot, he said, the little grey cells. We? Where do they actually come from? The insight, the connections. I watch you and I can see you observing, questioning, ordering. But the moment of knowing, where does that come from? Poirot smiled, and it was a genuine smile, not the small professional one he kept for witnesses, but the real one, which reached his eyes and made him look, for a moment, considerably younger. From listening, Hastings, not only with the ears, from listening to what people choose not to say, to what emotion runs under the chosen words, to where the story becomes too smooth or too rough. People tell you, always, what they need you to believe, but they cannot help also telling you what they actually know. The little grey cells, they hear both at once. He finished his tisane and set the cup precisely in its saucer. It is, in the end, not so mysterious. It is attention, sustained, disciplined, affectionate attention to the remarkable and endlessly surprising people who fill this world. The car horn sounded outside. They rose, paid, and nodded to the barman, who nodded back with the equanimity of a man who has seen everything and expects tomorrow to be much the same. The night air was cold and clean, smelling of heather and distance. In the car, as the lights of Harcastle fell behind them and the road north came dark and empty, Hastings said, "Next time, Poirot, somewhere warmer." "Next time," said Poirot, with perfect serenity. "We'll be wherever it is needed." He settled his hat, straightened his coat, and watched the moors pass in darkness. Already, Hastings suspected, thinking about something else. The end.